Hello and welcome to Books and Us, the podcast about learning about new ideas and getting inspiration from books. I'm your host Ranjit Monga, and every week I talk to authors about their ideas. I take up books in the non-fiction category. If you want to read about the podcast interviews, you can go to the news website www.globalbihari.com and search for the column Literary Speaking. This episode has been recorded over two sessions, so there is a slight variation in the audio during the podcast. A part of it was recorded on a different computer, so please bear with us.
What capitalism is producing is no longer in sync with what we need, right? So that growth has gone, has produced obviously the environmental problems. It has produced the inequality, and so I think those are now we need to say, all right, thank you, capitalism, for job well done. What's next?
Hello, all. Welcome to the sixth episode of the podcast Books and Us. Listeners, we are well into our second season and we are making an all out effort to discuss interesting topics. And today I have a very interesting topic in the sense that today we are going to talk about the future and going to look at the work of futurist Dr. Andy Hines, who has written a deeply insightful book, Imagining After Capitalism. Well, did you know that many economists are of the opinion that capitalism could be on its last legs? Actually, capitalism has existed since the last 250 years, and it began roughly with the Industrial Revolution. It is marked by private enterprise, competition, and when you relate it to the lives of common people, it means that the harder you work, the more monetary rewards you get. But in recent times, as we have seen, the system seems to be becoming a little outdated because, as you can see, that there is a lot of inequality in society. There is also the problem of climate change, which some say has come about because of increased and enhanced industrialization. So we have with us Dr. Hines, who will fill us in with the details of what is the expected scenario in a situation which he calls after capitalism. Dr. Hines, thanks for joining us on Books and Us.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It's really exciting to be able to speak with an audience from India.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Yeah, and we welcome you here. Dr. Hines joins us all the way from Chicago. He is Associate Professor and Program Coordinator at the University of Houston's Foresight Program and has vast experience in organizational consulting and as an academic futurist. He has helped many companies with his work as a futurist, among them Kellogg, Dow Chemical, Social Technologies, and many others. Dr. Hines is motivated by a professional hunger to make foresight practical and useful, and he believes that foresight can help deliver the insight that is so needed in today's organizations and the world. He's working towards making foresight more actionable in organizations and communities. So, Dr. Hines, what is the book really about?
Well, thanks for having me, first of all. And I will say that the second book I read about the future was called The Image of the Future by Dr. Fred Polak. It was written in the 1970s. What he talked about, and it's one of the things that inspired me to get into this whole business of the future. He did a study of the great civilizations of the past and said what seemed to be the common element, the common theme uniting the great civilizations of the past was this positive guiding image of the future. And when he was writing in the 70s, he was saying, well, as I look around, I don't see that positive guiding image of the future. So back in the 70s, he's saying we don't have this. And it really, it sort of touched me. And, I got into this work and, now that I'm closer to the end of the game, I said, so what should I do now? And, 50 years later, I look around and I see that same absence that we do not have a positive guiding image of the future out there. We're kind of trapped in this almost depression, right? This fear of collapse, and I think there's just sort of a general anxiety about the future. So one of the things I hope to do with this book is to put some ideas out there in terms of what might be positive guiding images of the future.
You have talked a lot in the book about the signs which are there that, capitalism is outdated and it doesn't fit into the world economy and the political system, as it exists today. So what are those indications? What were you able to find?
Sure. So first of all, I want to say I am not one of those folks who will demonize capitalism. I don't think
Mhm,
it's evil or bad or
mhm,
wrong. I think we have a whole class in our foresight program about systems thinking. And one of the key points of systems thinking, and capitalism is a system, is that a system's behavior
mhm,
is a function of its structure. What that means is systems are what a system produces is a result of the structure. And so capitalism is producing exactly what it's designed to produce. That has served us very well. And I thought your introduction about the going back to the Industrial Revolution, capitalism enabled us to grow the world economy. Now, as you pointed out, been some problems with that have really been magnified recently, right? So the growth it did its job. And as we move into a different future, what capitalism is producing is no longer in sync with what we need, right? So that growth has gone, has produced obviously the environmental problems that you mentioned. It has produced the inequality, and so I think those are now we need to say, all right, thank you, capitalism, for a job well done.
mhm.
What's next?
And this problem of inequality and the other things which are mentioned, which point to the fact that capitalism may be outdated now, are so acute here in India. And some figures had come out recently that the wealth in India is owned by a very few percentage of people at the top. And there's a recent report saying that a lot of people don't have any extra money to spend. So that really looks real out here.
So I did an earlier book on long-term value shifts
Mhm,
in terms of what people think are their priorities, what's important in terms of, if you will, how we live. And for a long time, capitalism has been supported by what we would call modern values. That say the route to happiness, if you will, is economic growth, it's competition, it's winners and losers, it's achievement, and it's victory. And again, that served us well in terms of producing growth that enabled us to raise standards of living. However, what's been happening underneath those modern values is something called, if we will, postmodern and integral values. So it's another set of values priorities. And those values priorities say what's important is not winners and losers, but sharing, right? Equality, participation, community, networking. So you have these new sets of priorities that are much more about like how do we benefit the collective as opposed to a few winners and if you, as you pointed out, mostly losers.
mhm,
So the what capitalism has been producing is no longer in sync with where our values priorities have been
mhm,
shifting. So there's a mismatch, a misalignment. And so that's, I think, is another key reason why people are starting to ask questions. Well, if you will, if we have this misalignment, what else? And I think that's the problem is we don't have a good sense of what else, what's
mhm.
next. And again, that's where I hope to step into the gap a little bit and maybe stimulate some discussion about that.
Yeah, and you have proposed three images like like guiding lights or guiding images for the future. And one of them, we can take them up one by one. The first one is the circular commons. And it is a reaction to the environmental problems that we are facing. Do you think that humanity will be ready for such a drastic change as proposed in this outcome?
I would like to just set the table just a little bit for these three images first, because I want
Mhm,
to be clear to the listeners that these are not, in a sense, these are not my creations. They're I synthesized.
mhm,
Basically, I started working on this topic back in 2012.
mhm,
We started talking about it in our graduate program, and I started, if you will, doing some scanning, which is what futurists do to look for signals of change. And about 2017, I said, "Oh, this is getting interesting." I
mhm,
actually think,
mhm,
back in 2012, I said, if you talk about after capitalism, nobody's going to listen. But about
mhm,
2017, it starts to get interesting. So I thought, so I really dug into some serious research and eventually started writing the book. And so what I found was, there were a lot of ideas about how a post, if you will, a post-capitalist future, but they weren't necessarily integrated programs. There were little pieces here and there,
Mhm.
uh, kind of scattered about. And what I spent several years doing is pulling these scattered thoughts together into these three images. So that's where they came from, thoroughly researched.
Mhm.
Again, we're not just somebody's imagination, but these are ideas that are actually floating around that most people who aren't paying attention to this kind of stuff aren't
Mhm.
really aware of. But
Yeah.
hopefully, now we can shine some light on them. So, in terms of the circular commons, as you mentioned, is certainly the environmentally driven image of the future. So, there's a lot of ideas about what would in a given the intensity, severity of the environmental crisis, what might that future look like? So I would say, I've been in the futures game now for 35 years. One of the most exciting ideas that I've seen emerge is this idea of the circular economy. And the basic premise there being that we need to use less and
Mhm.
reuse what we do make.
Mhm.
Recycling is in there, and I'm just going to say this because it just drives me crazy. I don't think recycling is really the key aspect. And I think we spend a lot of time talking about recycling, but it's actually a very, very difficult thing to do in any kind of an economic sense. So,
Yes.
how do we use less?
Mhm.
How do we reuse? And that's that circular aspect. And the commons aspect is this idea of, how do we manage those resources in common? Right? And that, there's some political overtones there. How do we, if you will, reinvent how we make our decisions as a society? So is that plausible? I mean, it from today's vantage point, it might look a little fantastical, no doubt, right? But nonetheless, the signals are there, right? And so it's one of
Okay.
those things as futurists, our job is to look for those signals and say,
Mm.
are there signs that we may be moving in this direction? So there are definitely signals. And I guess to kind of round that point out, what I would say, or we would say, is that it's about a 20 to 30-year journey. We're not saying that this is going to happen overnight. This is a
Mm.
really big transition that's going to take some time. There are
Mm.
signs and signals that it's happening, but it is definitely going to take a while.
This commons aspect, I guess, is present in all the three images because it is something which is related to the common management of resources, the decision making at the local level, and also publicly owned resources. Whereas in capitalism, we have privately owned resources. So this is going to be a very big shift. And I think this aspect is there in all the three images, right?
Indeed, it seems to be one of the most common themes for all of the dozens, if not hundreds of folks who have been,
Mhm.
thinking about this stuff. That does seem to be the now, I would not say that there is a clear answer on how we're going to do this. There is this
Mhm.
idea that, it's kind of a bottom-up, networked, more direct democracy, direct democratic decision making. Now, how you scale that up, well, that is
Mhm.
a big question, no doubt about it. But that seems to be the common theme, right?
Mhm.
And I would add one more thing. What we've seen, and I say this is really poignant in the US, is that in terms of like where is decision making authority happening, the federal government has been really unable to do much. So they've been kind of diffusing their responsibility down to the state level. The state hasn't been able to do much, so they're pushing
Mhm.
it down to the local level. And
Mhm.
we're finding that communities are now being, if you will, forced into making some pretty significant policy choices. And I think so that kind of diffusion from the center to the
Mhm.
kind of to the network has been a pretty big megatrend we've seen not only in the US but also globally.
And this aspect is also a very big part of your second image, which is a non-workers paradise. What are the features of this scenario?
Yeah, the main idea here is that, what does a post-work society look like?
Mhm.
And again, if you look at the long-term trends in terms of like the average work week, it's been going down for a long time, very
Yes.
quietly, very
Yeah.
slowly,
Yeah.
almost unnoticeably. And what I would say with the key idea of a post-work society is not that we don't have to do things, not that we
Mm,
don't have to do work-like activities,
mm,
but what that future would be is that you, if you will, you do not need a full-time job in order to access resources to make,
mm,
if you will, to make a living.
mm,
And that we will still need to, again, do things, but we won't need to do them in order to survive. And
mm.
that's really the big shift. And as you might imagine, that kind of circles back to one of the big discussions of the day as we see the advent of artificial intelligence and all these automation technologies. Could we use technology to do some of that work that, if you will, people are doing as full-time jobs?
Yeah.
And I think that would be a key enabler of that post-work society. So, like the one of the things to keep in mind is I think all these three images are, they're related to one another.
Mm,
But I tried to call out a particular aspect. So, what does a post-work future look like? How would we spend our time?
mm,
Uh, how would we? And then the big question there is how do we distribute the resources that will still be there, even
mm,
if we're
mm,
not, even if people don't have jobs, we're still producing the wealth. Maybe it's
mm,
produced by AI and automation, but we're still producing it. But
mm,
then how do we distribute it
mm.
in a more equitable fashion?
So isn't the concept of degrowth also related to this scenario?
Yes, and so it's interesting to see. So I remember when
Mm,
I first saw degrowth popping up around 2012,
mm,
2013, around there, and it was coming primarily out of France. And I thought, well,
mm.
here are the French again, coming up with a
Yeah.
really controversial but
Mm.
interesting idea.
Yeah.
And
And it's very
now I would,
powerful. It's very powerful.
yes,
Yeah.
indeed, right?
Yeah.
And this is the same thing that when it first comes up, you're almost afraid to mention it because people
Yeah.
will jump on you. But
Yeah.
now I think we're starting to have that conversation.
Mm,
And I don't think this means we're going back to, living in canvas paper sacks and
mm,
but it's basically, especially, and again in the very affluent late stage capitalist societies, that the
mm.
consumption has just gone kind of mad,
Yeah.
and how we've got to kind of calibrate that. And I like
Mm,
the even though degrowth is a bit radical, I
mm,
think it just brings front and center to say we've really got to rethink our consumption patterns. Right? We've
mm,
just got to, and if that idea of actually slowing it down gets the point across, then I feel like that's a valuable contribution.
mm, mm, mm. And it is also one of the aspects of the circular commons because it takes care of climate change.
Exactly. Now, I would
Mm,
say there's a really important caveat there in that, I'm primarily talking about the late stage capitalism and, the wealthier industrial countries, because there are many nations that are still in the earlier stages of development where they're
mm,
going to be saying, well, wait a minute, before we degrowth, So I think it's really a shift, right? It's a
mm,
shift of resources away from,
mm,
if you will, from north to south, if you can use that big analogy there. So I do think it's a really difficult challenge to say how, can a non-workers paradise, can that exist in one country
mm.
bordered by other countries where it doesn't exist,
Yeah.
right? Like how would
Yeah.
you, I mean, I think that, so there's some tricky issues to work out
To work
there.
out.
Yeah. And I think you could argue that one of the missions of the late stage or advanced industrial countries is how do, if you will, how do we enable that shift? How do we bring our partners in the South, if you will, up to
Mm.
a acceptable standard of living? So that could be a great piece of work for us to do.
Your third guiding image is that of tech-led abundance. And it talks about, a setting in the future, which is almost like a futuristic modern world, which we have seen in science fiction films also, that the work is taken over by machines or artificial intelligence, and people are free to, do other things. And there is so much abundance produced by tech that the humanity won't have to work. Is that what it is?
So that is I did find those images out there, no doubt about it, and probably the most developed, right? So I
Mm,
think it also fits mostly. It fits of the three images. It's the one that's closest today to today, right? Now, of
Yeah.
course, the big problem is most of that wealth goes to a
Mm,
very small fraction at the top.
mm,
And so in the tech-led abundance image, that redistribution takes place so that it's not just for the benefit of, the few winners in the
mm,
capitalist game, but everybody wins.
mm,
But that's a pretty big shift, right?
mm,
There's a pretty big political shift that would have to take place to enable that to happen.
mm,
I would also put just a little bit of a caution on, relying on technology as the savior, right? Which I think is definitely that's the ethos of tech-led
mm,
abundance.
mm,
I certainly think it could be used wisely as an enabler, but I think I hope we don't put too much faith in the technology to save us, right? I think it's a
mm.
combination of wise use of technology by people.
Could you give an example of this abundance produced by tech so that it's clear for the listeners what we are talking about?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so right now, like we are rightly, I think, concerned about people losing their job to technology because saying, there's a leading edge of companies that are saying, all right, we're going to use technology to eliminate entry level jobs. I mean, that's one of the things we're seeing happening right now.
Mm,
Now, in today's world, that is very traumatic if you are an
mm,
entry level worker who
mm,
can't find a job or has lost a job. However, that the work itself is still being done. The wealth is still being produced. So it's not that we don't have that, if
aha.
you will, that
Yeah.
money. We have that money.
Mm,
But then, how do you get that money to the people who've been displaced? I mean, that's the
mm,
short-term problem, right?
mm,
But so I guess, and if you extrapolate that forward, if we make this, if you will, I believe if we make wise choices and say, all right, these jobs here, we are going to displace and automate, right? Because
mm,
it doesn't make sense for people to do them.
mm.
Because in so many cases, the jobs that are being displaced are not great jobs. Nobody
Mm.
wants to do them. They want the money. They don't want
Yeah.
the job, right?
Uh,
So if we can use
mm,
AI, robotics to do those not so desirable jobs, but
mm,
and also be able to distribute that wealth to the people who are displaced, it can work. Now, again, that is again a very big challenge, but
mm,
you could imagine over time, sort of slowly, gradually replacing the kinds of work that we don't really want to do. And
mm,
if you will, let the machines do it.
mm. Yeah. And also, you talked about, I remember a very interesting thing is that tech will enable that the services which are hitherto not available to the masses, those services would be available, and also probably resources or things like electricity or they would become so cheap for people that there won't be a problem of access for people.
So we know that right now, if we were to take the resources we have available, let's just imagine if you could imagine like all the human capability,
Hmm.
and we took it and we distributed it evenly to everyone across the whole planet,
Okay,
we could
already.
all live in a relatively decent standard of living, right? Of
Yeah,
course, that's not how it's played out because it's
yeah.
all unequally distributed.
Hmm.
And so that's, if you think about it, that is probably the central challenge of this transition to Afro-capitalism is number one, how do we, if you will, how do we keep those resources coming, right? How do we keep them? How do we manage them, keep them growing? And then it's basically how do we, if you will, redistribute it more equally or more
Hmm.
even. Yeah.
And,
So it's
and
exciting, right? There is exciting potential here.
yeah, yeah.
But it is no doubt a difficult challenge.
And also, you have talked about that there are the transition will happen when the value systems of humanity changes, and you have seen indication of that. Right since the 60s, there has been a change of values. So, what are those values?
Sure. So there's a project. It's run out of the University of Michigan as the center, but it's all across the globe. And since the 1970s, they have been tracking, it's called the World Value Survey. They have been tracking values changes in over 140 countries. So
Okay.
most of the countries of the world.
Mm,
About every 5 years, they check in and say, how's things going, right?
mm,
So what those value shifts have been showing now, they take values change very slowly, right? I mean, you can imagine there are values of what are important, what are the important priorities that I use to make key decisions in my life. They don't change easily,
Mm,
but very slowly and steadily, there's been a shift away from, if you will, the material kind of material accumulation mindset, if you will, of the kind of the capitalist system towards, again, this more of a community
mm,
a community participatory kind of ethos, right? So
mm,
those shifts have been happening. Now, right now, when you look at a lot of the different countries, it's very true in the US, right?
mm,
We have almost a split between those two, right? And they're
mm.
almost this roughly the same size, right? Those two cohorts, and they're just banging heads against each other,
Yeah, right now.
and unfortunately not able to compromise and not
Yeah,
able to speak to each other. So we're just
yeah.
kind of in a stalemate situation.
So these values are, you have termed them as modern values, postmodern modern values, and integral values. And
Yes.
when humanity overwhelmingly reaches integral values, that is when we will go into the future.
Well, what it seems, so roughly, if you took the rough percentages, right? So if modern, I think, is probably it peaked around 40% of the world population, right?
Mm,
Postmodern, somewhere around 35%.
mm,
And then the integral, just about maybe 5%, depending on, how you look at these things, right?
mhm,
So those shifts, what has been happening is modern is losing its share as the postmodern and integral gain. The key
mm,
thing to keep in mind, that little 2 to 5% at integral, those are the real activists. Those are the
mm,
ones who are living, if you will, are pushing that sort of post-capitalist lifestyle. But they're a really tiny, tiny group, right? So you can barely recognize it.
And what are those values?
So the integral values are very much about activism, functionality, practicality. How do I make a difference?
Hmm.
And I think the key difference between the integral and the postmodern kind of support those ideas, but they're less likely to actively do it.
Hmm.
Right. So they'll be supportive of the, let's improve the environment, but may not do a whole as much about it. Whereas the
Yeah.
integral say, let's get in there and let's make this change.
Yeah.
And as those two segments start to grow, support for change and actual change, right? That those, over that next 20 to 30 years,
Hmm.
that becomes the more dominant paradigm. And that's, I think, when we'll start to see some really
Hmm.
interesting change. Now, we've got to get through the next 5 to 10 years. No
Yeah.
easy,
Yeah.
no easy feat, right?
And those people are also the ones who look for a higher meaning to life, right?
Absolutely, right. And I think we're all asking ourselves, well,
Yes.
right now, I don't even, I'm
Yeah.
not even sure if people are asking themselves yet. I think we're just kind of in this
Hmm.
um, almost paralyzed state of like, what is going on here? And I don't
Hmm.
think we're yet saying what could we do different? We're basically at the stage of what's going on, and I think the
Hmm.
next phase is say, all right, now that we know what's going on, what do we want instead? So I
Hmm.
hope that that's the question. Those questions start to emerge in the next, over the next decade. Like, what else could we do, right? So
Hmm.
right now, I don't think we have any really strong momentum to question the existing order. We're just kind of paralyzed almost.
Books in Us opens doors to knowledge and an understanding of the world around us. Let's discover together.
The Shattered Ceiling, a book by Geet Mala Jalota, on women pioneers of our times, changing the way women's contribution is perceived.
Okay, Dr. Hines, you talked about the signals which have got us to this state where we are thinking about these images, the guiding images for the future. So, what are those signals or the drivers which you think are already existing in society, which are getting us there?
So, in the course of the research, I identified seven what we call key drivers of change that
Mhm,
suggested we were moving away from the current capitalist system and towards something else.
mhm,
So, the first we've already discussed was the shifting values, and
mhm,
that the data from the World Values Survey, which has been going on since the 1970s,
mhm,
indeed was showing that the emerging value sets of postmodern and integral were incompatible with the current capitalist approach. We saw certainly a big upsurge in technology acceleration. Now, this is both good and bad, right? I mean, the good news is it could be a very powerful enabler of change. At the same time, it also brings up some really important, I think, risks in terms of the powerful technologies it's producing.
Mm,
We've certainly seen inequality emerge as a key driver, and really, it's we've always had inequality. It's just that, if you will, societies are saying we are we are no longer tolerating this.
mm,
So you see a lot more opposition to inequality. We've seen the emergence of automation, which again could be a good thing, but also the way it seems to be being applied, at least in the early stages, is basically throwing people out of work without a safety net.
mm,
We've had the fifth driver, as we call stagnation, which is basically
mm,
saying capitalism is running out of places to grow. We've
mm,
commoditized everything. It's so we
mm,
get into these increasingly bizarre ways to create, you might say, artificial scarcity in order to, if you will, sell us more stuff we don't need.
mm,
The climate and carrying capacity challenges, I think, are pretty obvious that the growth that capitalism is generating, causing
mm,
those pretty big ecosystem issues. And then
mm,
lastly, the one I call the ineffective left, which is, I think, on the left, political left of the spectrum, is just this inherent suspicion,
mm,
inability, unwillingness to develop a big image of the future. And it
mm,
tends, most of the ideas coming from the left tend to be very small, very local, and if you will, very politically correct, and having a challenge at trying to really bring large
mm,
groups of people together.
mm,
So what, in addition to these drivers, these horizon scanning signals that I mentioned,
mm,
we also are starting to see these little pockets of
mm,
after capitalism emerging around the
mm,
world. And,
mm,
one example, prominent one,
mm,
universal basic income. I think
mm,
10 years ago, if you had mentioned that, people would laugh
mm.
at you. But
Yes.
there's now literally hundreds of experiments all across the globe, and the
Mm,
the early results are that they are, been very net positive. And
mm,
even in the U.S., we had a presidential candidate who
mm,
ran on that as a platform. Now,
mm,
I'm not saying universal basic income is the answer, but it certainly is an
mm,
interesting
mm,
signal that we are moving in a different direction.
mm,
So I think those are some of the ideas that
mm,
suggest we are actually slowly moving towards this idea of after capitalism.
mm. At the ground level, what examples did you get of how these things got translated into the behavior of the youth, of the stories which you were scanning or reading? Like you mentioned UBI, but there were many other things which were happening, like dissatisfaction among the youth and among the populations. So, what is that like?
Yeah, I think amongst the surveys have consistently shown that younger the younger generations right now it's mostly opposed to capitalism, but
Mm,
not really having again any clear sense of what else, right? So it's
mm,
just opposition, it's just against, and
mm,
there's not a for. And I guess that again, that's the purpose of this book is to say, all right, let's
yes.
put some for
Mm,
in there. What do we know we're against? What are we
yeah.
for?
Yeah.
So, and I think in terms of the examples, you have things like, I don't know, you could talk about local currencies. You could talk about things
Mm,
like employee stock ownership plans.
uh,
The rise of the gift economy, the sharing economy,
mm.
things like yeah, so there's all kinds of these small scale examples of people
Like
moving
for
away
example,
from.
the sharing economy. I think tech is being used for that, right?
Yes, now that some would say, and I think with some justification, that that's also there's kind of a that can be like many things used in a couple different ways. To some
Mm,
extent, it can be like how do we pool resources more effectively?
mm,
I know we've done some work with libraries, and
mm,
they've been, for instance, loaning out not just books, but
mm,
like tools and actually people. Like
mm,
you can take out a plumber,
mm.
and so there's some really interesting things. On the other hand, some of the sharing economy, like some of the ride sharing, has basically just
Yes.
been another way to
Mm.
reinforce the old capitalist model, right?
Yes,
So,
and I recently saw an app here in India in which if you're going across town and you can put out your ride on an app, and if anybody wants to ride with you, you charge a minimum amount like 100 rupees or 200,
yeah.
and you can take two, three people with you. So that's I think a perfect example of what you were saying, what are these things, these things which are popping up.
Yes.
We are going towards sharing of resources, thinking more in terms of how we can bring things under a common umbrella.
Again, I would say that those are the kinds of things that we should expect to see more of as we move into the future, if in fact we are moving towards these after capitalism images.
And the youth, as I was saying, that they are very dissatisfied with the current system because of inequality, and also because many of them have are sort of rejecting this 9 to 5, work culture, and especially after COVID, I think it was very. It's become quite difficult for corporates to get people back to office, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think part of it is they're looking at their parents working themselves to near death, saying,
Mm,
I don't want that, right? Or,
mm,
why are we doing this? And asking
mm,
those questions. And I think, the youth are saying that, like,
mm,
why are we, why do we have these incredible extremes where so many people are struggling and,
mm.
so few are actually benefiting wildly? And I think they're just not happy with that bargain.
I saw another statistical chart yesterday in which it showed that worldwide people during the COVID, they held on to their jobs, but a year after COVID, the graph of people resigning from their jobs had gone really up. I mean,
Mhm.
people realize that maybe we should. What is all this worth? And let's just try to do what we want to do in life.
Right. And in the US, it was called the Great Resignation. I don't
Yes,
know
yes. Yeah,
how that's spread
those are the
overseas.
figures. Yeah.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, I think so now there was also a benefit, is the economy was kind of restarting. There
Mm,
was a lot more money kind of sloshing around. And
mm,
then, what's happened since then in the last year or two is that, as employers have kind of tightened the screws and demanded people go back to work,
mm,
it's been a little bit more challenging, right? And
mm,
there's less money coming. So it's kind of like we've gone back to
mm,
pre COVID normal, so to speak. And
mm.
so we had this like little experiment to see what would people do if they had the choice. They
Okay.
told us. Now we've ignored that, and now we're going, in a sense, trying to put the genie back into the bottle, as they say.
Mm.
And I don't think ultimate long term that's not going to be a successful strategy.
So yeah, you were saying that you asked people what they would do if they were free, right? It's in the book as well.
Yeah, I think I had a little fun with that. What are 10 things you could do if
Yes,
you
yes.
I actually there's a lot more than 10.
Mm,
And for folks who are busy working, and we laugh about retirement now. And in
mm,
retirement, most people that when they retire are
mm.
not like sitting around doing nothing. They're actually so many say that they're actually busier than they ever were, right? They're
Yeah,
doing the things that they
yeah.
if for those with the means, they're doing the
Mm,
things they've always wanted to do, and
mm,
it's often very, very active. So again,
mm,
I will certainly agree that some people might abuse a situation where they didn't have
mm,
to work, but I think most of
mm.
us would not.
There is also a scenario where we get stuck in the present system because it sort of reforms itself.
Absolutely. So again, I've been tracking, doing futures work for 35 years now, and I would say until about 10 years ago, so the first 25 years of my career, most of the clients and groups that I worked with, government, corporate, nonprofit, and all over the world, right,
Mm,
is generally people are pretty positive about their future, people in
mm,
their organizations. And about,
mm,
5 to 10 years ago, we started to see a shift
mm,
where now it's uncertainty, and now I think it's actually tipped into almost negativity.
mm,
And when we do the future of our various clients, organizations, when they look at their own future,
mm.
many of them are seeing that their current pathway is on, if you will, is on a collapse trajectory.
Really?
Yes, it is on a very, we'll just say a negative trajectory, if not collapse.
Mm,
So could we get stuck? Absolutely. And in the book, I do talk about that. I mean, I want to focus on the positive guiding images because I think we do have
Yeah.
plenty of collapse imagery out there.
Yeah, but
But nonetheless, it is a very realistic
yeah.
possibility, and we can't just hope we're going to somehow get to the magic land, right? We've got to do the work to get there.
Mhm. I asked this question because what is going on in the US right now and which is impacting the entire world. Maybe that's like a backlash and the system trying to, justify itself. So that's why I asked the question.
That is such a great observation. I
Yeah.
mean, yeah, I gave a little talk on after capitalism last night with a local group, and we
Mhm.
talked about we called it the death rattle. I don't know if that's a concept that you've seen, but what that means is that on the when an existing system is if you will dying or declining, right before it
Yeah.
dies is when it makes its loudest noise.
Yes.
And that
That's
could be what's happening, right? Is that this
yeah.
is the death rattle of capitalism, and it's
Yeah.
going to be loud and ugly, but it could, the hopeful thing is perhaps that we're ready to move past that.
And
We
because then
call that the
people
death rattle.
death rattle and because people see the real face of it.
It's
Eh,
kind of fascinating to
Yeah.
see. I was
Yeah.
having tracked this now for
Mm.
quite a while that I think there are and were and are a lot of very well-intentioned efforts to fix capitalism, right? I mean,
Yes.
there are a
Yes.
lot of ideas to how to reform it.
Mm.
And even though I am talking about, I think it's time for the new system, I would say that there is a lot of, I think there are things that can make it better, no doubt. And but like you say, I think we really have kind of shifted almost away from that into this, if
Mm.
you will, the ugly side of it is really showing its face at this
Mm.
present moment.
Okay, how do ordinary people relate to these concepts? Like, for example, the young generation who's got to live for 30, 40, 50, 60 years. What do you suggest? What would be your suggestion that how they prepare for the next cycle?
So I absolutely believe that, we really, as a futurist, I would imagine that having seen work with so many different groups and trying to get to a different future, that, it starts from this, where do we want to go?
Mm.
And once we have that, now one of the things that also came about in Pollock's research about the images of the future is the successful ones, they spoke to people's hearts. Like there was an emotional, aesthetic, spiritual, like, I really want this future. And
Mm.
I think that's the place to start is like we're, asking ourselves like what world do we want to build?
Mm.
Right. And kind of getting clear about like what direction do we want to go?
Mm.
And I think that having that that provides the motivation to do the very hard work of changing your life. Now, can we do things to be more environmentally sustainable in our lifestyle? Yeah, every individual can do things like that.
Yeah.
So I think that we ask ourselves those two questions, right? Like, where do I want to go, and what am I willing to do within my power, within my agency, right? Whether it's in my individual life, whether it's what I bring to my work, whether it's bring to my church, or what the various groups I work with. So I very much believe in that sort of bottom up grassroots, and I think that's where the power is ultimately going to come from.
Mm.
The local distributed networked bottom up approach.
The reason I asked was because people would ultimately, their concern is that, how do they earn money for themselves? So, getting used to a commons is going to take, a very, very big effort. So, how do they prepare? What would be the avenues for them, for survival if these images do fructify?
I think there's two approaches, right? And I think one is, if you will, one strategy, and I'm not necessarily endorsing it, is to
Yeah.
like literally disconnect from the existing system. When
Uh-huh.
we see these kind of off the grid communities,
Yeah.
intentional communities and movements. Now that's one approach,
Yeah.
and we might decide to do that.
Mhm.
The other is working within the existing system, and I think of this like when when my daughter was picking a major in college. She says, "Dad, you told me that there's going to be no jobs in the future, so I don't know what to do."
Yeah, yeah, that's
I'm
what I
like, "Well,
meant.
right? Look, we live in the current system, and we absolutely, even though we know we may have an idea of where we want to go with these images, we absolutely
Mm,
have to be practical and get inside that system and change
mm,
it from within. So yes, we should have jobs. Yes, we should get
mm,
degrees, and
mm,
so we need to do the sensible things, but I think we
mm,
need to, so we need to, again, unless you want to check out and kind of form your off the grid. And I think it'll be both things. I think we'll see both
mm.
things happening at the same time. But I absolutely believe in being very practical, getting in and changing those organizations, making those changes within the current structure as well.
A lot of the pointers which you mention in the book, one does see an indication of those. For example, a very highly charged group of uh, activists who endorse climate action. Then, of course, the community of technology startups and technology businessmen, and so these things really look real.
The reason I've kind of come to this sort of bottom up thing is when you look at where our leadership is, it's just there's a vacuum. And we're
Mm.
just not seeing any, bold leadership really emerging. So
Yeah.
I think it's going to have to be pushed,
Mhm.
pushed from the bottom, so to speak, and
Mm.
that ultimately, so it is. I certainly don't believe that bottom up can solve all of our problems. I think
Mm.
bottom up has to, if you will, push
Mm.
leadership to kind of
Mm.
bring those two things together. So,
Mm.
obviously we still need leadership, we still need direction, but I
Mhm.
think it just needs that push
Mm.
because we're just not seeing that leadership emerge, if you will, on its own. And I will add that one thing that worries me a little bit is I actually think, I don't want capitalism to collapse in the short
Mm.
term because I don't think we're ready. I don't think
Mm.
we're ready for, we need some time to, kind of get our heads around, well, what
Mm.
does that, if will
Mm.
post-capitalist future look like? So to me, I hope it's a more gradual than an absolute collapse. I think again, I just see that would there's a vacuum. So we have a lot of work to do, and
Mm.
hopefully we have enough time to do it.
So, how would you encapsulate all the learnings from your book?
Yeah, I heard this simple phrase
Mm.
as I was going through the research. We are now living in an economy rather than a society. And
Mm.
isn't that backwards?
Yeah.
Shouldn't the economy be serving the society rather
Yeah.
than the society serving the economy? And
Yeah.
it just when I heard that, I'm like, that's it. We've
Mm.
got it backwards, right? We're all about economic productivity. And we've got so immersed in this sort of capitalist
Mm.
consumption, paradigm that we can't step outside and say, wait, this is
Mm.
crazy. We've,
Mm.
let's use our economic wealth and
Mm.
approach to make a better living, right? And that should be the focus. And I think that's what I hope that we're getting at with these images. Let's shift that, rebalance that to its appropriate relationship, right? That we certainly do need an economic approach, but
Mm.
it should not be the goal. It should be the means and not the end. And I think that's where we've got to get that backwards right now. I want to live in a society.
Yeah. And you've talked about something which really opened my eyes that, yeah, this is really happening is that we are, everything is up for sale. Like everything, every service, everything is commodified.
Yes, and that's been a long-term trend. And essentially,
Yeah.
again, one of the reasons I think capitalism has kind of run out of gas, so to speak, run
Mm.
out of fuel, is that it's getting harder and harder to find new things to sell.
Mm.
So we
Yeah.
get almost crazier by
Mm.
the things that we put up for sale. And
Mm.
just to give an example from
Mm.
our own work, we're not exempt from doing some crazy things.
Mm.
One of our recommendations in a project was, well, you could provide parenting as a service. You could sell
Yeah.
parenting services. I was like,
Oh, yeah.
what are we
Yeah.
doing here, right? But it makes in the context of capitalism it makes
Yes.
logical sense. But it's like, what
Yes.
again? What have we done, right? And I think
Yeah.
that's where we're at. We're just the things that we're trying to create scarcity where it doesn't exist, and it's leading us into all kinds of kind of crazy schemes.
Yeah, in a way, we have to correct all that, or then there
Right.
is no stopping us going into that future.
Yeah. So again, this is overall capitalism did its job. Let's, congratulate it. Well done. And, it would just say now it's just time to adjust to the new situation. So let's not, let's not make it a bad thing.
Okay, you've written a book now. Where do you want this message to reach? Like, what impact do you want to have?
Now there's even what a great question.
Uh,
So the good news is I'm close to retirement age. So I'm kind of
Okay.
thinking, what do you want to do next, right? And part of that is, what I'd really like to do is get in and dig into some of those communities, movements,
Uh-huh.
spots where we
Uh-huh.
actually see this after capitalism emerging and kind of shine the spotlight on it, right? And
Yeah.
visiting, like, last year when I was out in Seattle, we visited this sort of state-of-the-art eco building, and it was just fascinating to do a write-up of that. So
Mm,
I thought, what I would like to do over assuming that there's sufficient interest, is to kind of highlight the emergence.
mm,
Where is after capitalism emerging, and kind
mm,
of explain it, because we need examples, right? We need
mm.
actual, and I think that's kind of what I've committed to do over the next, at least over the next few years.
So, Dr. Hines, thank you so much for talking to us. I learned a lot from your book as well as this conversation.
Well, thank you so much again. I'm so pleased to be able to speak to you and your audience. So thank you very much for having me.
So, would you like to share any contact details?
Sure. I think if to find the information about the book, I have a website. So Imagining After Capitalism,
Mm,
all one word. If you
mm.
type that in, that will bring up all the information. So if you want more, I'm blogging, talking, and so on.
Okay.
So again, and to me, the fun part of all this 10 years of research
Mm,
is now being able to sit down and talk with folks like yourself about it. So
yes,
thank you for that.
and get the message out there.
Yes,
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much.
my pleasure. Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye.
So that was Professor Andy Hines talking about what the future may look like as described in his book Imagining After Capitalism. Listeners, do let us know about your vision of the future in the sense, what are your views of what the future may look like? You can write to me at podcast@raymondproductions.org. That is RAMONPRODUCTIONS.org. Or click the link in the show notes which says feedback. You can also share about a book or an author you would like to put me in touch with. So that's all for today. Thank you for listening to this episode of Books and Us. This is Ranjit Monga signing off. Till next time, goodbye and take care.